So on today's show, we have Michael Barone, the mighty Michael Barone. What I like about Michael Barone, he writes this almanac of American politics, and he knows everything. When you meet Michael, the first time I met him, he's exactly like he is on TV. You say, how are things, Michael? Well, 30% of the people say they're okay, and then 40%. He just knows every fact and figure. So we asked him to put the news in perspective a little bit, because we know the news people aren't going to do that. All right, Michael Barone is an historian, journalist, political analyst. He's the principal author of the Almanac of American Politics. If you have never seen this, like every political fact on earth is in this book, and they're all in his head. I mean, I swear he must memorize this thing. You can watch or read Barone's special weekly feature, Michael Barone's Guide to Government, which is intended to provide brief, simple, educational, and enjoyable lessons for high school and college students at www.guidetogovernment.org. Michael Barone, I always like talking to him. He stays calm. He puts things in perspective. Here is our interview. Michael, thank you for coming on. I always love talking to you because you actually know stuff. You don't just go off the feelings of things. You actually know things. And so I want to check something with you. You wrote a column in which you were reacting to an Onion headline, 90% of Americans strongly opposed to each other. and recently, Marco Rubio sent out a tweet after the Parkland shootings. And he said, the debate after Parkland reminds us that we, the people, don't really like each other very much. True or false?
I think there's a lot of truth to it. It's you see that more when you've got people talking about politics, which is always at least partly an adversary process. Everybody laments that we don't sit down and say kumbaya together. But the fact is that you have elections, one side wins, one side loses. Elections even decided by a small margin, in 2016's case, unexpected margin, can have big policy consequences that mean a lot to a lot of people. So aside from the fact that everybody who disagrees with me is scum.
Yes, that's also a problem.
That's also a problem. But yeah, we're in an adversarial position. But I just was rereading portions of the historian Kenneth Stamp's book, America in 1857. And if you think we had divisiveness now, you can go back and read about 1857, which was followed 4 years later by something called the Civil War.
Well, that is one of the things that I feel is going on, is a lot of hyperbole. You mentioned this in your column, that this Russia spying, they indict these Russian trolls, and people are actually on TV saying this is the worst attack on America since Pearl Harbor. And I've heard actual commentators say that this is the most divided time since the Civil War. It is hyperbole, right?
Well, it is hyperbole. I mean, Russian influence in election, that lots of foreign powers have tried to influence American elections. And if you go back to the election of 1940, for example, you had British agents in the United States trying to affect the election and get the re-election for Franklin Roosevelt. You had the Communist Party in the United States, totally subservient to stop Joseph Stalin, opposing Franklin Roosevelt. This was the period of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, remember? And the progressives were supposed to think that it was okay to be allied with Hitler and you shouldn't aid Britain against Hitler. Roosevelt actually made a speech during the campaign where he said, I know what it's like to be opposed by the extremists of both the right, and thinking of the German-American Bund, and of the left, the Communist Party. So I think that was a little more malign and a little more threatening. And had, since they were speaking to a large number of Americans who did not want to enter World War II, a lot more influential than anything we've seen lately, where, they're spending $600 on Facebook ads in Wisconsin and running half of them after the election, which turned out to be not the optimal timing to influence the election. My old days as a political consultant, I can tell you that. We got November 15th all booked up here.
Yeah, they did seem a little bit like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. You talk about the mid-century moment, and this is one thing that I feel a lot of people feel, that we had something here. We had a kind of consensus where we were fighting, as Barack Obama once said, we were fighting over the 50-yard line, basically. And we feel that that's gone. Is that feeling justified? Has something collapsed?
Well, I think something collapsed that was not capable of being sustained indefinitely. I mean, the fact is, you know, those of us who were children in that mid-century moment, I think if we were at all attentive to politics and public affairs, and naturally I was, you know, preparing to appear on Fox News and the blog and everything at that point, you know, there was a sort of consensus about foreign policy, the Cold War foreign policy, bipartisan support, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, et cetera. And you had on the domestic side a sort of thinking that, well, we're divided on economics between the unions and the management of the big companies. This was especially true in Michigan, where I was growing up. But that's, after all, just about dollars and cents. You can cut compromises. You can split the difference. You have negotiations, and those are just numbers. And, you know, if the numbers are not perfect from your point of view, they're also not dreadful. It was a period where we had confidence in our leaders. Why do we have confidence in our leaders? Well, we just won a world war, and we just went into a post-war prosperity boom when everybody thought we were going to go back to the Great Depression, almost everybody. So, boy, they really seem to have performed well, yeah. And I think we sometimes have the impression that all of American history was a time when everybody had confidence in the leadership and the institutions. I think that, on the contrary, I think that mid-century moments in 1945 to 65, date it when you will, was an unusual period in American history after great achievements that had been won by big institutions, big government, big business, big labor, with participation of millions and millions of citizens in one way, shape, or form or another, and participation for which they were rewarded with things like the GI Bill of Rights and honored for their participation in it, in a common effort. You know, we had 16 million men, few women in the military, in a country that's entered the war with 131 million people. That's huge mobilization. It's a huge putting country in uniform, if you will. And that provided a kind of consensus. We also had a kind of consensus about religion at that time and about moral views. Was there a debate about abortion? No, abortion was a crime. Was there a debate about gay rights? No, homosexual behavior was a crime. Was there a debate about guns? Well, you have Gallup poll in, I believe, the late 1950s said that a majority of Americans were for banning handguns possession altogether by private citizens. It wasn't a lively time for the Second Amendment. We were trusting our leaders and our uniformed armed forces and law enforcement to do that. And those were attitudes that were unlikely to be sustained. Go back to, I was reading a book called America in 1957, the historian Kenneth Stamp. That wasn't a consensus country at all. That was a country about to go into a civil war over the issue of whether or not slavery should be extended or abolished. And that was a period when people didn't have trust in all the institutions. And I think looking over other parts of history, go back and read the rhetoric between forces backing John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800.
But you know, you said, I mean, I remember the 70s as a terribly depressed, somebody once called the 70s the decade when the West tried to commit suicide. And you have said,
well, with bell-bottom pants and disco music, it was nearly close.
Maybe that's why they tried to commit suicide. You called it a slum of a decade, but you also say that it's kind of haunting us. Why are the 70s? Why didn't we just leave that behind? Why are the 70s still haunting us?
Well, it's interesting. You know, the formative career in business and also sort of commentary in public affairs of Donald Trump came in the 1970s. His father had made a lot of money building housing for people in the outer boroughs of New York and Brooklyn and Queens, help from political connections and so forth. decade of the 1970s, New York City lost 822,000 people. Population decline. That's a pretty astonishing number. Basically, white ethnics were leaving New York City for the suburbs, for Florida, for place, farther out, low tax New Jersey and low tax Connecticut, as they then were. And Donald Trump said, well, there's no money, not going to be great money building housing for people when you got 823,000 people leaving. But with land prices in Manhattan at rock bottom and the political connections I got through my dad, I'm going to move into Manhattan, buy low and pay with other people's money. And that was his strategy, and it proved to be a successful one for Democratic Party. Well, where, Nancy Pelosi was elected, the roots of the Democratic leaders go back to the 70s or even before. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was elected to the Northern California Democratic chairman in 1977. Dianne Feinstein, the senior senator from your wonderful state of California, was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, which was then an island of something like sanity, back in 1970, and became mayor after the murder of her predecessor in 1978. You had people like Chuck Schumer, elected to the New York Assembly in 1974, a few months after he graduated from Harvard Law School. No problem with a private sector career in between, and so forth. So that's, Hillary Clinton is active, and Bill Clinton chairing the McGovern campaign operation in Texas in 1972. These folks go back a long ways, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of Democrats have just sort of assumed that they're going to get rid of Donald Trump, they're going to impeach him, they're going to get him out of office by the 25th Amendment. Well, that's something like had happened in the 1970s when they were young and frisky, and Richard Nixon was thrown out of office, and they figure that's what happens when you got a Republican president you really don't like.
Speaking of Trump now, a lot of people look at Trump and they see an earthquake, but you actually say that he pulled off basically a sleight of hand with the electoral votes. He basically dumped one group of white voters and picked up another group of white voters. Can you explain that a little?
Well, I call it the Trump trade. He said basically, okay, I will trade you. I will give up 2 to 3 million white college graduates who voted for Mitt Romney and pretty regularly voted for Republicans going back into the 1990s in this period of polarized partisan parity. I'll give those up. In return, I want to grab 3 to 4 million white non-college voters. And what happens? How many electoral votes does he lose by losing those white college voters? Well, he does worse in California than other Democrats, a little worse in Arizona, worse in Texas, a little worse in Georgia. Doesn't change any electoral votes. The white non-college, what happens to them? Well, they enable him to carry places that Mitt Romney didn't carry, and to carry Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the 2nd Congressional District of Maine, 100 electoral votes. Bingo. Yeah. I spoke to a group here in Washington this morning, and I said, okay, I'm going to poll you. How many of you think this was a brilliant, thought out strategy and so forth? And how many of you think it was dumb, blind luck? And 3 or 4 people raised their hand on brilliant strategy. A large number raised their hands somewhat hesitantly on dumb, blind luck. And then I added, and how many think that it had something to do with the deficiencies of Hillary Clinton? And about the same number raised. So that's what happened. It surprised everybody. Some people less than others. Nate Silver of the 538.com website said there was a 29% chance that Trump would win. Well, 29% chances happen 29 times out of 100, and this was one of them. And the New York Times analyst, upshot analyst Nate Cohn wrote an article back in June. He said, actually, there's more white non-college voters out there than the exit polls suggest. That the people conducting the exit poll concede that, in fact, that is true. He said, and there's a pathway for Trump to go forward if he can pick up these voters in a variety of states, particularly in the Midwest, which of course accounted for 70 of his 100 extra electoral votes as compared to Mitt Romney. So, there were some reason to think that that was possible. Obviously, there were a lot of disappointed people in the Javits Center somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock on and not just at the Javits Center, all over the country, or at least on the East Coast, in Chicago, coastal California, and so forth.
So, looking forward, then, well, let's go just two last things because I'm running out of time, unfortunately. The midterms. When you're looking ahead at the midterms, I keep hearing about this blue wave, and yet I also see little signs that maybe not so much. What do you think?
Well, I think this is a race. The House of Representatives, the Democrats need a net gain of 24 seats in order to get a majority and make Nancy Pelosi Speaker. The results in special elections, Democrats have done pretty well, and they have. The Republicans have not succeeded in getting the measure of support from non-college whites that the Republicans have. Now, offsetting that, special elections are low-stakes things where people often will cast a protest vote, knowing that they're not going to change who's in control. They're just changing one seat. So they're not perfect indicators of what's to come. You have Democratic advantages in the generic vote question. That's gone. That diminished in mid-February. It's widened a little bit now. We're still not out of range for the Republicans to prevail because in equal population districts, the Democratic Party has a disadvantage because its supporters tend to be demographically clustered in central cities, sympathetic suburbs, university towns. They get 70, 80% there, which means those votes aren't available to win in districts where Republicans have been getting 55 to 60%. So they have a disadvantage there. I think that we haven't also seen the thing play out. A lot of Democrats are enthusiastically running for office, supporting candidates. A lot of them want impeachment of the president. Nancy Pelosi, who's been around, as I said, for rather a long time, says, no, we shouldn't be talking about that. She's, I think, operating on the assumption there's some quantum of voters that like to rebuke the Republicans, reduce Donald Trump's power, and give the Democrats the majority. They don't want to go through another futile impeachment exercise like 1988, 99. So there's a variety of things going there. The other thing is that Trump's job performance rating, which is about 41% job approval at this point, boy, by historic trends, that's not enough to give his party a majority in the off-year elections. But when you look at his favorable, unfavorable ratings, they're actually less unfavorable now than in November 2016. And I'll remind viewers of what happened in November 2016. He was elected president. Maybe the old rules don't apply to this somewhat unusual president.
Interesting. I have to stop there. I'm out of time. But Michael Barone, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it. Always fascinating.
Okay, good to be with you. Take care, Andrew.
Always a little different to talk to somebody who actually knows facts. It just isn't just spewing his opinions. But really interesting. The part about the 70s I thought was really interesting, that we're stuck with this decade when the West almost killed itself before Ronald Reagan came and Margaret Thatcher and the Pope and kind of brought us back.